I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Liz Truss quits as Prime Minister after just 6 weeks in office. The shortest-serving Prime Minister in British history will be out of Downing Street by next Friday after a chaotic few weeks in power.
2022, the year of 3 Prime Ministers at least. After an astonishing decade in British politics, another unprecedented moment.
Who will be the next Prime Minister? Could Boris Johnson attempt a comeback? Or will it be Rishi Sunak or another former leadership candidate? Disbelief across the UK as Downing Street implodes in the middle of a soaring cost of living crisis.
It just needs stabilising, needs sorting out and moving forward, because the rest of the country is in turmoil, isn't it?
We're following some breaking news out of the United Kingdom after less than 2 months on the job.
We'll be asking how much damage all this political chaos is doing to the UK's reputation around the world.
On BBC London, reaction from the borough where Liz Truss started in politics. We'll be live tonight in Greenwich and we'll be finding out what the political turmoil means for Londoners.
Good evening. Liz Truss has resigned after 44 days in office. She is now the shortest-serving Prime Minister in British history. Just 24 hours after she told MPs defiantly that she was a fighter, not a quitter, she is on her way out, her fate sealed by the resignation of the Home Secretary yesterday and the chaotic scenes in the House of Commons last night as more and more Conservative MPs voiced their disbelief at what was going on. Sir Graham Brady, the head of the powerful 1922 committee of backbench Tory MPs, went to Downing Street this morning at the request of the Prime Minister. At 1:30 this afternoon, Liz Truss emerged outside Number 10 and announced that she had spoken to the King and was resigning. A new Prime Minister is expected to be in place by the end of next week at the latest, but it could be as soon as Monday. Well, let's go straight to our political editor, Chris Mason.
Liz Truss as Prime Minister, the fastest, shortest and steepest roller coaster in British political history. She rose to the highest office and then crashed from it in record time, faster than any of her predecessors, crushed and humiliated by the reality of such a short tenure. There is never a more important time in British politics than when you can't answer the question, who will be our Prime Minister in a fortnight? Today is one of those moments, yet again. Lunchtime in Downing Street and the lectern is back. 6 weeks and 2 days since Liz Truss stood behind it as she became Prime Minister, she was back too. This time, to resign.
I came into office at a time of great economic and international instability. Families and businesses were worried about how to pay their bills. Putin's illegal war in Ukraine threatens the security of our whole continent, and our country has been held back for too long by low economic growth. I was elected by the Conservative Party with a mandate to change this. We delivered on energy bills and on cutting national insurance. And we set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
So what on earth happens now?
This morning I met the chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady. We've agreed that there will be a leadership election to be completed within the next week. This will ensure that we remain on a path to deliver our fiscal plans and maintain our country's economic stability and national security. I will remain as Prime Minister until a successor has been chosen. Thank you.
What an extraordinary moment, just 3.5 months since Boris Johnson stood at that lectern and resigned himself. Now his successor has done just the same. The chaos deepens. Enter then this man, Sir Graham Brady, who the Prime Minister mentioned, who will oversee the race to replace Liz Truss. What's he got to say?
Good afternoon, everybody. There's not a great deal that I can say at the moment. I have spoken to the party chairman, Jake Berry, and he has confirmed that it will be possible to conduct a ballot and conclude a leadership election by Friday the 28th of October.
Do you accept that this is a complete dog's dinner?
It's certainly not a circumstance I would wish to see.
So what do the other parties make of it? The Conservatives' rivals say it's time for a general election. Call blimey, another opponent for you to face. What do you make of it?
Well, it is another opponent, and, you know, we're burning through prime ministers, we're burning through chancellors, we're burning through home secretaries, and that gives it an element of soap opera. But it isn't just a soap opera, and this is, you know, for many people who are facing higher prices, higher mortgages, this is real damage that's being inflicted on them. I really don't think that another revolving door of chaos, another experiment at the top of the Tory party is the way out of this.
What needs to happen now? Well, on a UK level, there must be a general election. It is a democratic necessity. The idea that the Tories can unite behind a Prime Minister now, any Prime Minister, let alone one that is in the public interest, I think is for the birds.
The Tories have shown that they're incapable of providing the leadership. They're not fit to govern our country. We don't need another Conservative Prime Minister. They need to go. We need another general election, and Conservative MPs have got to do their patriotic duty and vote for that.
How did all of this happen? The era of Liz Truss is far too short to even deserve that word. This was her arriving as Prime Minister last month.
Chancellor. Thank you.
In short, nearly her entire programme for government imploded on contact with reality.
Mr. Speaker, we're at the beginning of a new era, and as we contemplate, that's right, a new era.
Mini-budget maxi-disaster, as her colleagues called this privately. The markets tanked, so did her poll ratings, and her MPs lost faith almost instantly. The other night I asked her, will you lead the Conservatives into the next general election?
I will lead the Conservatives into the next general election.
Definitely.
Well, look, yeah.
And even yesterday she said,
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
Now it turns out she's done with fighting and she's quit.
I want to thank my reverend friend.
So who will take over? You might just remember this guy.
Hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
Hasta la vista. See you later. Might we again? Some Conservatives would love it, others hate it. Last time's runner-up Rishi Sunak is another possibility, as are Cabinet Ministers Penny Mordaunt and Kemi Badenoch. And the woman who resigned as Home Secretary yesterday, having a pop at Liz Truss in the process, Suella Braverman.
You looking forward to number 10, Jeremy Hunt?
The answer is no. The new Chancellor has ruled himself out. In the last few minutes, Sir Graham Brady, who'll run the contest, and the Conservative Party chairman Jake Berry had more to say about how the race will work.
Nominations are now open. Will close at 2 o'clock on Monday. Candidates will be expected to have at least 100 colleagues nominating them.
That if the party should decide to put forward 2 candidates, there will be an expedited binding online vote of Conservative Party members to choose its next leader. All stages of the leadership election will be concluded by no later than Friday the 28th of October.
Who might find themselves moving in here a week tomorrow? After what's happened to Liz Truss, you might imagine it could give some second thoughts. Poisoned chalice it might be, but prized it still is. And tonight, the race is underway.
So, Chris, give us a bit more detail about what happens now. It's Tory party members who are going to be voting again.
Yes, possibly. Let me walk you through those rules for this race that got underway at lunchtime, and we now know how it will run. So, nominations are open, so those who want to stand can say that they want to stand. They will close at 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, and crucially, MPs who fancy the job will have to get 100 nominations from Conservative MPs. So the bar is high, and when you do the maths, it means there can't be more than 3 MPs who would get onto that ballot. Then there will be voting, and that will eliminate one of the candidates, and there will be 2 left, assuming there are 3 in the first place. Then, amongst the MPs, there'll be a further ballot amongst those 2, what's being described as an indicative ballot, so that party members would know where the balance of opinion lies in Parliament. Why does that matter? Well, if a Conservative leader can't command a majority in the House of Commons, in other words, amongst their own MPs, they are done for. Case study, Liz Truss. So that indicative vote will still happen. If at that point there are still 2 candidates, in other words, one of them doesn't drop out, it then does go to the Conservative membership in the country, but there won't be the T-shirts and the slogans and the mini manifestos and an expedition around exhibition halls and town halls. Instead, an online ballot to ensure the result can be sorted out by a week tomorrow. So this is democracy in a micro sense amongst a tiny number of people in the grand scheme of things, done at lightning speed.
What about all the people sitting at home saying, why can't there just be a general election now?
And not just you sitting at home, if that is your view, but also, as you heard just there, the leaders of so many of the opposition parties here at Westminster too. The straightforward answer is that we live in a parliamentary democracy, and if a Prime Minister can command a majority in the House of Commons, then they can govern on behalf of their party until that parliamentary term runs out, which is technically January of 2025. The reason Liz Truss is out is because she couldn't do that. So if the new Conservative leader can do that, then technically, constitutionally, they could carry on that long. But politically, they will come under huge pressure because they won't have a mandate, unless, of course, it were to be Boris Johnson who came back. If it wasn't him, then they'll have to make a decision. Do they say, look, we accept that we don't have much of a mandate and therefore let's bring the election forward to a particular date, perhaps next year, or not? Because the political clamour for that general election will be mighty loud.
Chris Mason, thank you. Well, this is all, of course, happening at a moment when millions of people are grappling with the soaring cost of living and worrying about how they're going to pay their mortgages, their energy bills, their food bills. Our North of England correspondent Danny Savage was talking to people in the Yorkshire town of Wetherby as the news broke this lunchtime.
By the Conservative Party.
Lunchtime in the Black Bull in Wetherby. This was quite the conversation stopper.
That I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
No surprise, but what now? And what are the consequences of this?
I feel quite ashamed, really, to be honest. When we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? We were saying that anybody from outside England would be very disappointed and, laughing at us.
We've got to give the country confidence back, because there certainly is a lack of confidence here. Otherwise people that would normally vote Conservative, like myself, will think very differently if they don't get it sorted.
As the latest Tory bubble burst, people in this Conservative constituency are frustrated and fed up. Wanted some stability, please.
The Tories stab everybody in the back. There's no leadership. They stab Boris. I liked him as a character. Yes, he made mistakes, but he had a majority and was voted for. We are a great country. We have been a great country. We are a great country, and we still will be if we could just rally behind some decent leadership.
Liz Truss's time as Prime Minister will be remembered by many for rocketing interest rates and mortgage deals being pulled after that mini-budget. You sense the housing market won't miss her.
If you could sit down with senior Tory politicians now around your desk in Wetherby, what would you say to them?
Sort yourself out, for goodness sake. Yeah. Let's have some confidence in what you do, and let's have a policy that's going to be acceptable, not just to the country, but to the rest of the world.
In local cafes, politics was the talk of the town.
I did say to Marianne earlier on, shall we have Boris back? No, no. But, I think that...
Some people think that's the answer.
Well, I think he got some vision of things that could go right. I do.
Back in the pub, they were debating about what happens next.
It just needs stabilising, needs sorting out and moving forward, because the rest of the country is in turmoil, isn't it?
The electorate and the world wants answers fast, along with a large slice of certainty and stability. Danny Savage, BBC News, Wetherby.
Well, what does happen now? Liz Truss will remain in Downing Street until next Friday at the latest. A new leader will be named next week, the third Prime Minister in the space of just 2 months. Who could it be? Whoever it is will need the backing of at least 100 Tory MPs by Monday afternoon to make the final two. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has already confirmed that he will not stand. But Boris Johnson, who was forced out of number 10 just 6 weeks ago, could be preparing to attempt a comeback. Liz Truss's former leadership rival, Rishi Sunak, is the bookmakers' favourite. The leader of the House of Commons, Penny Mordaunt, is also likely to stand, as is the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who resigned yesterday, and Kemi Badenoch, currently International Trade Secretary, could also be in the running. Conservative Party members, only around 160,000 of them, may be involved again in choosing the next Prime Minister, who will be in Downing Street by the 28th of October. We will know by next Friday at the latest. So what do Conservative voters make of the collapse of her premiership after so little time? Our Midlands correspondent Navtesh Johal has been finding out.
Shopping for a new leader. In this traditionally safe Conservative seat, party members and voters have been watching recent events with consternation. Simon Robinson is the leader of Rushcliffe Borough Council in Nottinghamshire. How have you felt in recent weeks as a Conservative Party member and leader of a local council?
Disappointed, surprised. I've never seen anything like it. Things happen so quickly, and not just at Prime Minister level. Obviously, we've seen ministers resign as well. So it really has been quite chaotic. It's been very unique. It's been very challenging.
Who do you want to see take on the mantle of leader next?
Well, I think what's absolutely key is experience. So on that basis, I would probably go for Rishi Sunak. That he's been in government. He was Chancellor.
Well, Rushcliffe is a true blue Conservative constituency. The former Chancellor, Ken Clarke, was the local MP here for nearly 50 years. There's a Conservative club just around the corner. But the recent events appear to have damaged at least some of the support around here. You've been a Conservative Party voter.
I have in the past, yes. And I wouldn't vote Conservative now, no.
Why not?
Because I don't feel we can trust them. I feel the whole fiasco with Boris, and followed by the whole fiasco now with Liz Truss, I just don't feel I can support them anymore. I feel we need a change.
I think, like a lot of people, I'm put off by what's going on. They've not covered themselves in glory at all.
The Conservative Party, you're put off from voting for them at the next general election, whenever that might be?
I'm afraid so at the moment, yes.
As thoughts turn to the next Prime Minister, one familiar name kept returning among Tory voters.
Bring back Boris.
Is that what you'd like to see?
Well, he did a good job on Brexit. I think somebody over there agrees with me, so yes, bring back Boris.
Well, personally, I'd bring back Boris. That's my answer, really.
We hear that he may be throwing his hat into the ring. Why do you want to see Boris Johnson return?
I think he was an excellent leader. He made mistakes, he admitted to it, he apologised eventually. But I think he's a good all-round leader. He got us through COVID, he's got that presence that Liz hasn't got.
But not everybody was looking ahead. The pace of events means some haven't even had a chance to catch up on today's news.
She'll get over it. She'll survive.
She's resigned?
No, I didn't know that.
She resigned earlier this afternoon.
Oh, it surprises me.
Oh, really?
I'd have told her to stay.
Navtesh Johal, BBC News, Rushcliffe.
Well, let's go back to Chris Mason. And Chris, could Boris Johnson really make a comeback?
That is the big question tonight. The return of Boris Johnson, question mark. He remains the giant of his party, and strikingly those around him are neither confirming nor denying that he will run, but therefore entering into that vacuum is all of the speculation. Now, amongst his parliamentary colleagues, there are no doubt those who really like him. There's also no doubt there are those who really, really would not want him back whatsoever. And there's talk among some MPs of defections, resignations, by-elections, were that to happen. Amongst the Conservative grassroots, were it to get to that and a contest between the final two, polls such as they are suggest that Boris Johnson is still popular. It seems that anyone who was to take him on in a final round would fear that he could win, that he could return. And just one final thought on all of this, because of course, yes, there are other names, Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt and Suella Braverman and Kemi Badenoch. There's a temptation just sometimes in politics to rule out the unbelievable. And right now, and certainly in the last few weeks, the idea of Boris Johnson returning, particularly so soon, would have seemed unbelievable. The lesson of today is don't rule out the unbelievable.
Chris, thank you. So the shortest serving Prime Minister ever, and her time in office unravelled very fast. Liz Truss was appointed on the 6th of September and she chose Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor. Less than 3 weeks later, he unveiled his mini-budget, which spooked the financial markets with its large unfunded tax cuts. Days later, the Bank of England made an emergency intervention, buying up government bonds to try to stabilise the situation. Only 38 days into the job, Kwasi Kwarteng was sacked, replaced the same day by Jeremy Hunt, who went on to scrap most of the measures in his mini-budget. Yesterday, Suella Braverman resigned as Home Secretary over data breaches to be replaced by Grant Shapps. Chaos reigned in the House of Commons last night over a fracking vote. And now the Prime Minister is going too. Our Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young reports on the most extraordinary collapse of power.
Liz Truss blamed global events for her troubles, but this record-breaking, humiliating downfall was almost entirely self-inflicted. From the start, she didn't enjoy the overwhelming support of colleagues. Just 50 Conservative MPs had her as their top choice in the first round of the ballot. Some experienced political commentators always had their doubts too.
Everyone who's ever worked with Liz Truss will tell you that she doesn't take advice, and she wants to hear from people that she's right, and that you get frozen out if you start telling her that she's wrong. It's a way to make your way so far and so fast in business or politics, but there comes a point when that tin-earedness to contrary advice brings you down.
But Tory party members had been impressed over the summer as she set out her radical tax-cutting agenda.
But what I'm about as a Conservative is people keeping more of their own money, growing the economy so we avoid a recession.
Her rival, the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak, predicted that approach would have serious consequences.
Your own economic advisor has said that your plans would mean that interest rates would have to go up to around 7%. So just think what that means for all of your mortgages.
His warnings were ignored and Liz Truss entered Downing Street as the fourth Conservative Prime Minister in just over 6 years. Her programme for government was put on hold when just 2 days after being appointed, Queen Elizabeth died and the country entered a period of mourning. When political life resumed, the Prime Minister and her Chancellor surprised everyone, including the rest of the Cabinet, with their plans to cut the top rate of income tax for the wealthiest. Despite the turmoil, Ms Truss refused to back down.
Are you absolutely committed to abolishing the 45p tax rate for the wealthiest people in the country?
Yes. And it is part, Laura, it is part of an overall package of making our tax system simpler.
Many Tory MPs who'd gathered for their party conference were furious, especially as rumours were circulating that benefits wouldn't rise in line with inflation. A U-turn was announced the following day. Within 2 weeks, Liz Truss had sacked her Chancellor and was forced to sit stony-faced as his replacement ripped apart almost all of her economic plan.
The Prime Minister and I agreed yesterday to reverse almost all the tax measures announced in the growth plan 3 weeks ago that have not been legislated for in Parliament.
And it wasn't just policy problems. For years, critics had highlighted Liz Truss's poor communication skills, including this speech.
We import 2/3 of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
And in recent weeks, some hesitant interviews haven't helped her precarious situation.
We're going to spend more in mortgage fees under what you've done, based on the predictions, than we would have saved with energy.
I don't think anybody is arguing that we shouldn't have acted on energy.
Plenty of Conservative MPs expressed doubts about Liz Truss's abilities before she became leader, but her friends say she wasn't given a chance to prove herself. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, Liz Truss's hold on power has been precarious almost from the very start, but it was her mini-budget that caused turmoil on the markets and unintentionally left millions of people with more expensive mortgages that sparked her rapid decline, as our business editor Simon Jack reports.
The road to Liz Truss's demise arguably started here. A not-so-mini budget that she and her Chancellor announced with great fanfare.
And I commend it to the House.
Trussonomics promised £45 billion worth of growth-boosting tax cuts. But there was a problem. There was no explanation of how it would be paid for and no analysis from the budget watchdog as to whether the sums added up. But the Chancellor was defiant and promised more giveaways over that weekend.
There's more to come. We've only been here 19 days. I want to see, over the next year, people retain more of their income.
The financial markets didn't like it one bit. They thought it showed a reckless approach to the public finances. The pound, already weak, fell to its lowest level in history against the dollar. The cost of government borrowing rose so quickly, the Bank of England had to get involved, and that pushed up other borrowing costs. Mortgage rates, which were already rising, spiked even higher, with the cost of an average two-year deal now over 6.5%. The markets gave a massive thumbs down to Trussonomics. So the plan was stripped of almost every major measure. An £18 billion cut in corporation tax, a 1p cut in income tax, energy subsidies for all for 2 years, all binned by replacement Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. The financial markets were reassured, a measure of calm was restored. And even today, as the Prime Minister herself is toppled, the markets have barely moved. How come?
So Jeremy Hunt is considered a safe pair of hands by financial markets. He has put in place the policies of Rishi Sunak, and they liked Rishi Sunak. They gave him a lot of credence in the markets. I think what the markets could potentially be afraid of down the line is who is going to be our next Prime Minister.
But businesses like this drinks firm in Sunderland have found the political and price instability hard to manage.
For us, clarity and certainty are the things that I think every business is struggling with. It's certainly what we're struggling with. We've been through a cycle where we were getting a cost increase on raw materials every month, and that needs to settle.
Very few businesses feel in a position to help grow the economy, which was and is the government's goal.
So confidence has slumped. There's no recruitment, there's no investment, there's no exporting. All these are down. So you need some political stability for people to make decisions to employ someone, to invest or to expand their business. That is not happening at the moment, and politics needs to catch up.
In 11 days, the government is due to publish a revised and independently scrutinised economic plan. Until then, a cloud hangs over the markets and the wider economy. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Well, our economics editor, Faisal Islam, is with me now. Tell us more about the market's reaction today when Liz Truss resigned, and also about the wider impact this is likely to have on the UK economy.
So pretty calm in both those borrowing markets that Simon's been referring to, and also in currency markets. There was a bit of enthusiasm when the resignation was first announced, but almost a little bit of uncertainty has now opened up as to exactly where things go from here. I think if you step back from this extraordinary, I think it's 44 days now, I think the lesson is that if you're going to be radical in economic terms, make sure you look competent and credible and stable, and probably don't do it at a time when the global economy is looking a bit shaky, because that was too much for the markets, and essentially this radicalism put a target in terms of British assets. And so I think the other issue here is that the calmness we've seen really over the past 3 or 4 days is predicated on a set of assumptions around Jeremy Hunt's leadership at number 11, around a set of policies to fund those unfunded tax cuts, cancel most of them, find the spending cuts over the next couple of weeks. And the question now is, are we sure that the other leadership contenders are going to stick to that? You can imagine many of them, most of them, perhaps all of them saying, you know, we stand by Jeremy Hunt's plan. But to the extent that they don't, That injects uncertainty into the markets, things open back up, and the instability we've seen in the brief Truss administration could yet outlive her.
Faisal Islam, thank you. Well, what about the reaction right around the UK to Liz Truss's downfall? In a moment, we'll hear from Chris Page in Belfast and Thomas Morgan in Llandudno. But first, let's go to our Scotland editor, James Cook, who is in Edinburgh. James.
Sophie, yes, I mean, a great shock here, as it is across the UK, and the same calls here from the Scottish National Party that we've heard from the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer in terms of calls for an immediate general election. That's what Nicola Sturgeon told me when I spoke to her a short time ago. She said it was now a democratic necessity that the country should go to the polls. What of Liz Truss? She was the fourth Prime Minister that Nicola Sturgeon had to deal with, but in truth, she didn't deal with her at all. Liz Truss said during the election campaign for the Conservative leadership that she would ignore Nicola Sturgeon, and in the end, that is what happened, because the two of them in the 45 days had no formal discussions at all, no telephone call whatsoever. They exchanged a few words informally after the death of the Queen, but there was no formal start to the relationship between the two governments, so it's difficult to really assess where it got to. What happens now? Well, Nicola Sturgeon said that Liz Truss would be a footnote in the realms of political history. And I asked her about Boris Johnson, about the possibility of his returning to British politics at the highest level. She said that was a ludicrous idea and a ridiculous idea. It's worth pointing out that the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross is not at all keen on that idea either. He said this evening, people know where I stand when it comes to Boris Johnson. But just taking a step back, Sophie, and considering the potential implications for the debate about the future of the country. I mean, 8 years ago, when Scotland voted against independence, a lot of the discussion was that people should vote no, because to do so would ensure stability and prosperity. And Nicola Sturgeon and other supporters of independence now say, well, look around, that has completely failed to materialise. In fact, the opposite has occurred. And in their view now, although there are still, of course, difficult questions about independence, not least about the economics, they say that what's happening at Westminster advances the cause of independence, although, of course, the Labour Party say it's really about advancing the cause, in their view, for a Labour government.
James Cook, thank you. And Chris Page in Stormont, what about the reaction in Northern Ireland?
Well, Sophie, it's been said in the last few days that Westminster had ceased to have a functioning government. Well, Northern Ireland has been without a fully functioning devolved government since February. That was when the Democratic Unionist Party, in effect, withdrew from the power-sharing institutions here at Stormont. And the DUP says it will continue to block the formation of a Stormont executive unless the Brexit trade border with the rest of the UK is scrapped. There's no sign of that happening anytime soon. Now, next Friday, the 28th of October, is the latest potential end point for the Conservative leadership contest. But here, that date was already in the diary. That's because it is the legal deadline for a devolved government to be formed. So as things stand, the current Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, is set on that day to call a new election to the devolved assembly. It's thought that would take place on the 15th of December, just about 7 months after voters last went to the polls. There's no doubt that today's events in London have increased the instability. The Stormont parties think, though, that it is still more likely than not that fresh assembly election will be called at the end of next week. The only certainty, though, is that there's a lot more uncertainty.
And Thomas Morgan in Wales, the reaction there?
Well, just 2 days ago in the Welsh Parliament, there were some extraordinary scenes from the usually calm and considered First Minister Mark Drakeford, the leader of the Welsh Labour Party. He was visibly raging at the opposition leader, accusing the Tory party of making a mess of the economy. So it'll come as no surprise that Mark Drakeford was scathing of today's events and Liz Truss's government, calling it a complete and utter failure. There was no leadership at all. And another reason he might have been so so scathing, as similarly as to what happened and what's happened in Scotland, is that deteriorating relationship between Cardiff Bay and Westminster. When Boris Johnson was in charge, the relationship was fractious at best. But when Liz Truss came to power, it was non-existent. There wasn't a phone call between them at all. She didn't get in touch with him. Now, it's worth saying that when it comes to the next steps, Mark Drakeford said that it was unlikely, ridiculous really. He said that the Tory party could credibly have a leader that could take them through till 2024, echoing those calls for a general election. Now, when it comes to Boris Johnson, Tory members here in Wales, they might be for that because, of course, in 2019, he managed to equal their best ever result for here. Now, meanwhile, here in Llandudno, tomorrow, Plaid Cymru are due to start their conference. Leader Adam Price was probably hoping to focus on delivering his vision for the future for Wales. Instead, he's had to weigh in on today's events. Another voice in that growing wave of opposition leaders calling for a general election.
Thomas Morgan, Chris Page and James Cook, thank you all. And if you're just joining us, this is an extended BBC News at 6 on the day that the Prime Minister resigned. The news where you are will follow here on BBC One at 7 o'clock. Now, leaders around the world have reacted swiftly to the news that the UK will have its third Prime Minister this year. President Biden said the US would continue its close cooperation with Britain on global issues and thanked Liz Truss for her partnership on the Russian war with Ukraine. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, said the most important thing was for Britain to find stability as soon as possible. Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley has been looking at the global reaction.
We're following some breaking news out of the United Kingdom after less than 2 months on the job.
Her resignation made headlines around the world, capturing the international bewilderment at the chaos in the UK. This from Italy, no stranger itself to short governments. And a German journalist found herself having to repeat the expletives used by one MP last night.
I'm furious and I don't care anymore. Ich übersetze das jetzt mal nicht, aber das ist eine Partei, wo wirklich...
In Brussels, EU leaders holding a summit to discuss the world's energy crisis were for a time sidetracked by the extraordinary political drama here.
I won't get involved in the political life of the UK. I hope in any case the UK can again find stability. That's good for us and good for Europe.
Stability is very important, and we would like to see the UK system within its capacity to be in a position to have a successor selected as quickly as possible, and that stability will be brought to the situation given the fairly significant geopolitical issues facing Europe.
At the weekend, Joe Biden took the unusual step of making clear he was no fan of Liz Truss's economic policies.
I disagree with the policy, but that's up to Great Britain to make that judgment, not me.
Today, he had warmer words for her.
But look, she was a good partner on Russia and on Ukraine, and the British are going to solve their problems, but she was a good partner.
But diplomats who spent their careers trying to build up Britain abroad, such as this former ambassador to the US, are looking on at the political turmoil of the past few weeks with horror.
A reputation built up over decades seems to me to have been sacrificed, to have been ruined almost overnight. It's a really sad moment to see this happening. I would never have expected it, and it feels almost surreal to see events unfold in this way. I just hope that we can get some stable and competent and effective government back and rebuild our reputation, but it's going to take quite a long time.
Today, predictably, Russian television mocked Liz Truss. The Foreign Ministry said Britain had never known such a disgrace as Prime Minister. But Britain's allies are fervently hoping for a period of political calm, with the myriad problems facing the world, not least the threat that Russia poses. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
Well, let's talk to our North America editor, Sarah Smith, who is in Washington, and to our Europe correspondent, Jessica Parker, who is in Brussels. Sarah Smith, first of all, just tell us more about the reaction in the United States.
Well, in a written statement, President Biden has talked of the enduring friendship between the US and the UK. And then his chief of staff also issued a statement in which he used those magic words that British Prime Ministers love to hear. And he talked of the special relationship between the two countries. But of course, you can't have any kind of relationship with a partner who has no stability and no reliability. What the White House really want to see is a return to stable government and a Prime Minister in office who's going to stay there long enough for it to be worth the President building a relationship with. I mean, it was highly unusual for President Biden to make those remarks about Liz Truss's economic policy. US presidents do not interfere in other countries' domestic politics like that. But then, of course, these are not normal times. He did praise Liz Truss as being a reliable partner on Ukraine, and that's what the White House will be looking for most in the next Prime Minister. Someone who is committed to continuing to help Ukraine and holding Russia to account for the war. That's really important to the White House, not least because President Biden has cast that as an existential battle between democracy and autocracy. The other thing that there are deep concerns about here in the White House is the post-Brexit Northern Ireland protocol, and they're worried about what implications that could have for peace in Northern Ireland, and that's something that matters a great deal to President Biden personally. He'll want to take that up with any new incoming Prime Minister as well. But mostly what the White House are looking for, the people in there who have been watching open-mouthed at what's been going on in the UK over the last few days. They want somebody who is reliable, stable and going to stay the course. They just want a return to boring politics as normal and somebody that they can deal with across the Atlantic.
And Jessica Parker in Brussels, EU leaders are gathering there this evening. I can imagine this is all going to be a hot topic of conversation for them.
Yeah, I mean, EU leaders were arriving for the summit as the news of Liz Truss's resignation broke. They were strolling down that red carpet that British Prime Ministers, of course, used to stroll down. And immediate words of reaction to the news included that it was unfortunate, but also predictable. Luxembourg's leader even listed off the British Prime Ministers that he has known since 2016, because some here are pretty clear. They see the instability in the UK as flowing from Britain's decision to leave the European Union. But put that aside for one moment, they are also calling for stability in the UK as well. Why? Well, of course, the UK is a major economy on the EU's doorstep. Then there's the energy crisis. Now, that's what they're actually preoccupied with here tonight. And the UK and the continent are quite literally connected in terms of energy supplies. Then there are those post-Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland, still unresolved. Talks have resumed and the mood music was getting better. And then, of course, there's the Russian invasion. And many countries, particularly towards the east, have highly valued the UK's support for Ukraine. But more broadly, I think Europe has been watching what's happening in the UK recently with a level of fascination. People here talk about how they've traditionally seen Britain as a pretty stable country, not one of those known for political and economic volatility, but that reputation has certainly suffered in recent times.
Jessica Parker and Sarah Smith, thank you both. And just to say, there will be a special edition of Question Time at 8 p.m. this evening, live from Cheltenham with Fiona Bruce on BBC One. You can also watch it on the BBC iPlayer. Some of the day's other news now, and an American woman has pleaded guilty from the United States to causing the death of a teenager by careless driving in Northamptonshire in 2019. 19-year-old Harry Dunn was riding a motorbike when he was killed after a collision with a car outside an RAF base. Anne Sakoulis, whose husband works for the US Embassy, appeared at the Old Bailey via video link from her lawyer's office in Washington, D.C. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford reports.
It's more than 3 years since Harry Dunn was killed in a head-on collision outside a US base in Northamptonshire. This afternoon, wearing the green of his favourite motorbike, his family arrived at the Old Bailey in London to see the American woman responsible finally admit her guilt in court. Appearing by video link from her lawyer's office in Washington, Anne Sakoulis, with her dark hair tied back, pleaded guilty to a charge of causing Harry Dunn's death by careless driving. Harry Dunn was just 19 years old when he died, and his family have campaigned hard to get the case to this stage, when once a court case seemed impossible.
It's been really tough, honestly. But today, honestly, it feels just like the sun's come out. I didn't know if we'd ever get to this stage sometimes, and thankfully for today, with the support of these guys and you guys, we've got there, and we've got justice for our son. I really feel that.
Emotions were running high, but they were partly feelings of relief. Afterwards, his mum Charlotte told me that on the night he died, she'd promised Harry she would get justice for him.
Little did I know that it would take me this long to carry out that promise, but I was never going to give up. Never broken a promise to my kids, and if I'd have had to carry on for another few years, I damn well would.
And do you feel today that you've kept that promise?
Yeah, I do. That's what's making me so emotional, because it's been a really long 3 years.
On the day of the accident, Anne Sakoulas drove out of this US base. Unfamiliar with driving in Britain, she went onto the wrong side of the road, remaining there for more than 20 seconds until she hit Harry Dunn on a blind corner. The base where her husband worked is a highly secretive communications centre, and she flew out of the UK 19 days later, claiming diplomatic immunity. The judge has now directed that Anne Sakoulas should return to the UK to be sentenced next month, though there's no way of enforcing that. Daniel Sandford, BBC News.
People who work with children and don't report allegations of child sexual abuse should be prosecuted, according to a long-awaited independent inquiry. It's among a set of wide-ranging reforms recommended following a 7-year inquiry which described child sex abuse in England and Wales as horrific and deeply disturbing. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons reports.
The testimony heard in this room has been devastating.
Of the 8 boys in my dormitory at St Leonard's, 6 are now dead from drug overdoses and suicides.
Devious perpetrators protected by institutions more worried about their reputations. Today, the final verdict of the panel which has heard it all.
The nature and scale of the abuse we encountered was shocking and deeply disturbing. This is not just a historical aberration which happened decades ago. It is an ever-increasing problem.
So what's the recommendation? Well, this huge report says that anyone who works with children and fails to report direct evidence of child abuse, either witnessing it or being told about it by a child or a perpetrator, could be prosecuted and fined.
And what would that requirement mean in real life? These campaigners, supporting each other, survived abuse within the Jehovah's Witnesses, a religious sect.
Were there moments when it could have been reported outside the Jehovah's Witnesses?
It was his word against mine. At no stage were the police contacted, and therefore, because he denied it and they couldn't take it any further, he was allowed to continue with the abuse to the point where years later he raped me.
If there'd been mandatory reporting at that time, that abuse would have stopped instead of carrying on for another 5.5 years.
Not just reporting, but also sanctions necessary so that if people don't obey that particular law, that some action can be taken against them.
But victims' lawyers question how many people would be prosecuted for not disclosing abuse.
Somebody would have to have been told by the child, by the perpetrator, or they would have had to have witnessed it themselves. How likely is that?
Very rare in my experience of the vast cases that I've dealt with over many, many years. And that is a problem with the proposed legislation. Yes, that bit's fine, but it doesn't deal with the vast majority of cases that I see, which is where a report is made of concern.
The government will now consider the recommendation. Today, Labour said it would change the law. Tom Simons, BBC News.
I'm joined now by our Home Editor, Mark Easton, and this report has been a long time coming. Its findings are devastating. How much of a milestone is it?
I think what this report chronicles is how an evil, corrupted and infected almost every corner and crevice of our society. And it forces us to confront this question. How could it be that an apparently civilised and cultured country like ours could allow this extraordinary and awful cruelty to children, generation after generation, a cycle of suffering that turned and turned. Now, today's report comes up with an answer, but it doesn't make for easy reading. It says that our response to child sexual abuse reflects our attitude towards children. Now, when they cried for help, we didn't listen, we refused to believe, and we turned away. But today's report, I think, has an even greater importance than its recommendations on how the mechanisms of child protection should work. I think this has to be a turning point when our society confronts the unfathomable suffering of generations of children, but also to recognise that children will be abused today and tonight and tomorrow. And if we truly care, we must all do whatever we can to make it stop.
Mark Easton, thank you. Well, let's go back to our main story now, the resignation of the Prime Minister Liz Truss after just 44 days in office. It came after she made multiple U-turns on much of her economic policy, sacked 2 cabinet ministers, and much of the party turned against her. We'll have a new Prime Minister by the end of next week at the latest, and this is how the coming days will shape up. Nominations are now open for the Conservative leadership contest. They will close at 2 p.m. on Monday afternoon. Tory leadership hopefuls will need at least 100 nominations from MPs to make it through. There will be hustings later on Monday, and MPs will vote to whittle the number of candidates down. The final 2 candidates will go to an online vote for Tory party members, and everything will be concluded by Friday, the 28th of October, and the country will have a new Prime Minister. Liz Truss has become the shortest-serving Prime Minister in British history, and this was the moment at just after 1:30 this afternoon that she announced it was all over.
I came into office at a time of great economic and international instability. Families and businesses were worried about how to pay their bills. Putin's illegal war in Ukraine threatens the security of our whole continent, and our country has been held back for too long by low economic growth. I was elected by the Conservative Party with a mandate to change this. We delivered on energy bills and on cutting national insurance. And we set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party. This morning I met the chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady. We've agreed that there will be a leadership election to be completed within the next week. This will ensure that we remain on a path to deliver our fiscal plans and maintain our country's economic stability and national security. I will remain as Prime Minister until a successor has been chosen. Thank you.
Liz Truss speaking at just after 1:30 this afternoon. Let's go back to our political editor, Chris Mason, for a final word. I mean, it has been quite extraordinary watching this all unroll at lightning speed, and we have no idea what is going to happen next.
We don't. Liz Truss, the history maker, for all the wrong reasons. The most efficient, speediest humiliation in British political history. But whatever your politics tonight, spare a thought for her on a human level. So crushing was her failure. It's made global headlines, and that will hurt so soon after rising to the highest political office in the land. That in itself a triumph for anyone. But the reality is she bequeaths to her party and to the country chaos. And from that chaos will emerge a successor. That race underway tonight to become the next Prime Minister, and they will face a colossal task. But there will be a contest. There is ambition to succeed her. In the words of one senior Conservative MP just the other day, you have to remember that my colleagues are ambitious, so ambitious, they would happily inherit dust. So that contest begins to determine who is our next Prime Minister. Yes, another Prime Minister, a speedy process, all resolved by a week tomorrow.
Our political editor, Chris Mason, thank you. Time now for a look at the weather with Louise Lear. Hello.
Hi there, Sophie. Quite literally first thing this morning, we had stormy skies across Westminster. As you can see, a lot of heavy rain. We should have guessed, really. Rumbles of thunder by about 6:30 this morning across the London area. And some of that rain really was quite intense indeed. In fact, it brought a couple of inches of rain in just the space of 2 hours. So the heaviest of the rainfall first thing this morning, well, that was across the London area. The rumbles of thunder, the heavy rain started to drift its way steadily north as we went through the day. And actually, we've still got some wet weather hanging around at the moment, sitting across northern England, gradually drifting its way into eastern Scotland. And it will linger through the night here. So we've got some rain across eastern Scotland. At the same time, the next low starting to wind its way in from the southwest, driving in some sharp showers. Sandwiched in between the two, we could see some low clouds, some mist and some fog forming. But once again, it's going to be a very mild night. Many of us seeing double figures to greet us first thing tomorrow morning. But we've got this next Catherine wheel of low pressure sitting out to the southwest. It's going to be flicking up these weather fronts around that low. Plenty of sharp showers to look out for again tomorrow, and some of them heavy and thundery. So sharp showers into the southwest, gradually drifting their way steadily north and east. So nowhere immune from those showers as we go through the day tomorrow. They will rattle through at quite a pace as we see strong winds, maybe gusting in excess of 50 miles an hour on exposed southwest coast. But look at the temperatures, still very mild as we head towards the end of October. We're looking around 18 or 19 degrees the high. Here's the start of the weekend. One front drifting away. This little bump in the isobars here, that's a ridge of high pressure quietening things down before the next Catherine wheel of low pressure and frontal systems start to push in. And because the winds swing round from an anti-clockwise direction, the wind coming from the south, so it's driving up this incredibly mild air right across the country. So as we go into the start of the weekend, not a bad start for many across England and Wales. Dry, settled and sunny, the best part of the weekend really. There will be showers across Scotland and into Northern Ireland, and eventually by the end of the day, here we go again. The next low starts to move in, the rumbles of thunder perhaps starting to develop as well. And once again, those temperatures still pretty mild for this time of year. So for the second half of the weekend and into next week, we keep that mild theme, but we see showers or longer spells of rain. It stays pretty stormy, not just in Westminster, across the UK generally. Sophie.
Louise, thank you very much. And that is all from us on a momentous day in UK politics. In a moment, we will have the news where you are here on BBC One. The One Show will be starting very shortly on BBC Two. Don't forget, Question Time at 8 o'clock, a live edition with Fiona Bruce on BBC One. And Hugh Edwards, of course, will be back here at 10 o'clock with all the latest news. But we leave you tonight with a look back at Liz Truss's very brief stay in Downing Street. Just 44 days in power. Goodbye.
I have just accepted Her Majesty the Queen's kind invitation to form a new government. I'm honoured to take on this responsibility at a vital time for our country.
Promise, Your Majesty.
With lower rates of corporation tax and lower rates of personal tax. We promised to prioritise growth, Mr. Speaker. We promised a new approach for a new era. We promised to release the enormous potential of this country.
I've put in place a new Chancellor with a new strategy to restore economic stability.
There will be more difficult decisions, I'm afraid.
I will lead the Conservatives into the next general election.
Definitely.
Well, look. Yeah. I am a fighter and not a quitter.
I think it's a shambles and a disgrace. I think it is utterly appalling.
I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.